In 1914, Britain controlled nearly 25% of all land on Earth. London was where the world's money flowed. The British pound was what everyone used for international business. Their navy ruled every ocean. No empire in human history had ever been wealthier or more powerful. Then they made one decision, one single choice that seemed completely reasonable at the time. Within 3 decades, Britain would be financially destroyed. Their empire would crumble. Their currency would become irrelevant. And standing where they once stood would be a nation that hadn't even existed when Britain was just getting started. This is the story of the greatest economic power shift in modern history. To understand how Britain lost everything, you need to grasp just how dominant they really were. Britain in 1914 wasn't just another powerful country. They were the center of gravity for the entire global economy. The British Empire stretched across 13 million square miles. They controlled India with its hundreds of millions of people. They owned Canada, Australia, vast chunks of Africa, and strategic ports throughout Asia. 1 out of every 4 humans on the planet lived under the British flag. But the real source of British power wasn't the red patches on the world map. It was the incredible economic machine they had built underneath all that territory. Britain had industrialized first. While other nations were still farming with horses and hand tools, British factories were producing textiles, steel, and machinery. British railways moved goods across continents. British steamships connected distant markets. They weren't just making products. They were building and controlling the entire system that moved products around the world. The Royal Navy protected this global network with over 300 warships. Britain followed what they called the two-power standard. Their navy had to be larger than the next 2 largest navies combined. Nobody could threaten British trade routes. And because nobody could threaten those routes, everybody used them. It was the perfect economic monopoly. Then there was British financial dominance. The pound sterling was backed by gold reserves and centuries of accumulated wealth. It was stable, trusted, and universally accepted. If you wanted to conduct international business anywhere in the world, you did it in British pounds. If your country needed a loan for infrastructure or development, you went to London banks. Britain functioned as the world's central bank, the world's factory, and the world's police force simultaneously. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, there was a much younger nation watching all of this very carefully. The United States in 1914 was definitely not a superpower. Not yet. Yes, America was geographically enormous and blessed with incredible natural resources. But politically, America was isolationist. Militarily, they were weak compared to European standards. Economically, they were still dependent on European markets and European approval. Americans looked to Europe for cultural sophistication, financial expertise, and international legitimacy. But everything was about to change, because Britain was about to make a choice that would destroy the very foundations of their global dominance. The decision didn't seem catastrophic at the time. In fact, most British political leaders genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. But this is how empires always fall. They make choices that seem necessary in the moment, but prove ruinous in the long run. June 28th, 1914, Sarajevo. An obscure archduke gets assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. Within weeks, Europe exploded into the most devastating war in human history up to that point. Britain made the fateful decision to join this conflict. They had treaty obligations to honor. Germany appeared to be a rising threat to British interests. From a strategic perspective, going to war made complete sense. But World War I wasn't like previous European conflicts. This war consumed absolutely everything. Millions of soldiers. Entire national economies reorganized for military production. Ships, aircraft, tanks, and artillery shells manufactured by the millions. The scale was unprecedented in human history. And the financial cost was absolutely staggering. Britain's daily war expenses reached £9 million by 1918. £9 million every single day. Before the war started, Britain's total national debt was £650 million. By the time the war ended, that debt had exploded to £7.4 billion. The entire British economy had been restructured for military production. Factories that normally made civilian textiles were now producing military uniforms. Shipyards that built merchant vessels were now constructing destroyers and submarines. Here's the critical problem that would prove fatal. While Britain was spending all of its accumulated wealth on the war effort, they completely stopped investing in the economic activities that had made them wealthy in the first place. British exports to international markets collapsed. Other countries started developing their own manufacturing capabilities. Global trade routes were disrupted by submarine warfare. The economic machine that had generated Britain's wealth for over a century was breaking down. Someone had to pay for this enormously expensive war, so Britain turned to the only place that still had available capital. America. This is the exact moment when global economic power began its irreversible shift. Not on some battlefield in France. In loan agreements signed in New York and Washington. When World War I erupted, the United States officially declared neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson told Americans they should be impartial in both thought and action. That policy of neutrality lasted approximately 5 minutes. While America wasn't sending soldiers to fight in European trenches, they were sending something far more valuable in the long term: money. In 1915, Britain and France desperately needed $500 million in loans. J.P. Morgan and Company arranged the financing. American banks and private investors provided the capital. Then the Allies needed more money, and still more. American companies began selling steel, weapons, food, oil, and everything else required for modern warfare. American factories that had been sitting idle were suddenly operating around the clock. By 1917, Britain owed the United States $4.7 billion. Think carefully about what this represents. For over a century, the entire world had been financially indebted to Britain. Britain was the creditor nation, the lender, the country with economic leverage over everyone else. Now, for the first time, Britain owed enormous sums of money to America. The fundamental power dynamic had completely reversed, but Britain had absolutely no choice in this matter. Without American financial backing and material supplies, they would lose the war against Germany. So they kept borrowing and kept buying American products. Then, in April 1917, America officially entered the war as a full combatant. 2 million fresh American soldiers deployed to the European battlefields. These were troops with industrial backing from a nation that hadn't been economically devastated by 3 years of total warfare. The arrival of American military forces broke the stalemate on the Western Front. By November 1918, Germany finally surrendered. The Allied powers had achieved victory, but the cost would prove impossible for Britain to recover from. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Britain sat at the negotiating table as one of the victors. But financially, they were completely ruined. Britain's total debt had reached 140% of their gross domestic product. Their economy was shattered. Unemployment was skyrocketing. The pound sterling was no longer backed by gold reserves in the same reliable way. Even worse, Britain's empire was becoming restless and expensive to maintain. India was demanding independence. Ireland was in open revolt. Colonies throughout Africa and Asia that had contributed soldiers and resources to the war effort now wanted political concessions in return. The cost of maintaining imperial control was becoming economically unbearable. Meanwhile, America was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom. The war had done the exact opposite to America's economy. It had enriched and strengthened them dramatically. American industrial capacity had expanded massively during the war years. American banks had replaced British banks as the primary source of international capital. The United States dollar was rapidly becoming the preferred currency for global trade transactions. The American Navy was also growing rapidly. In 1916, Congress authorized the largest naval construction program in American history up to that point. The strategic goal was crystal clear: build a navy capable of challenging British naval supremacy. Britain simply couldn't compete financially. They couldn't afford to. In 1922, Britain agreed to the Washington Naval Treaty. For the first time in over a century, they accepted naval parity with the United States. The famous two-power standard was officially dead. Britain was no longer the unquestioned master of the world's oceans. But the transition from British to American dominance wasn't complete yet. Britain still possessed significant global influence, still controlled their empire, still maintained international prestige. But empires don't collapse in a single dramatic moment. They erode gradually, and that erosion was about to accelerate dramatically. October 1929. Wall Street crashed. The Great Depression spread across the entire world like a deadly contagion. Banks failed everywhere. Factories closed permanently. Unemployment reached 25% in America and even higher percentages in Britain. The global economy was in complete freefall. Then came the second catastrophic war. Germany, humiliated and economically devastated after World War I, had fallen under the control of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. By 1939, Europe was at war again. Britain, still financially recovering from the previous war, now had to fight an even more expensive conflict. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940. France had fallen to German forces. Britain stood completely alone against Nazi Germany. Churchill desperately needed weapons, ships, aircraft, and supplies. He needed them from America. President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to provide assistance, but America was still officially neutral, and many Americans remained isolationist. Roosevelt discovered a clever way around these political constraints. The Lend-Lease Act passed Congress in March 1941. America would lend Britain ships, planes, tanks, food, and everything else they needed to continue fighting. Britain would supposedly pay for everything later. But the fine print of these agreements told a very different story. Britain had to transfer military bases to American control. They had to share advanced technology. They had to ship their gold reserves to America. They had to sell off international investments and liquidate centuries of accumulated national wealth. By the end of World War II, Britain had spent or transferred virtually every financial asset they possessed. Britain's total debt by 1945 exceeded 250% of their gross domestic product. They were completely bankrupt. When Allied leaders met at Yalta in February 1945, the new international hierarchy was unmistakably clear. Roosevelt and Stalin were making the major decisions about the post-war world. Churchill was present at the meetings, but Britain was no longer driving the conversation. The baton of global leadership had been definitively passed. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Britain was technically on the winning side, but the financial cost of victory had completed what World War I had started. In 1947, India achieved independence. Britain simply couldn't afford to maintain control anymore. Over the following 2 decades, colony after colony would gain independence. The British Empire gradually dissolved. By the 1960s, the British Empire had effectively ceased to exist, but the economic transition from British to American dominance had actually happened even earlier. July 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 44 nations gathered for a conference that would define the structure of the global economy for the next 70 years. The Bretton Woods Conference focused on one primary objective: rebuilding and reorganizing the international financial system. America was completely in charge of these negotiations. The conference participants decided that the United States dollar would become the world's new reserve currency, not the British pound, the dollar. All other national currencies would be pegged to the dollar's value. The dollar itself would be backed by American gold reserves. If any country wanted to conduct international trade, they would use American dollars. The conference created 2 powerful new institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Both organizations were headquartered in Washington, not London. Both were dominated by American influence and American priorities. In 1948, America launched the Marshall Plan, $13 billion to rebuild war-torn Europe. That's over $150 billion in today's purchasing power. Why would America spend so much money on European reconstruction? This wasn't charity, this was grand strategy. A rebuilt Europe would buy American products, use American currency, and align with American geopolitical interests. America wasn't just wealthy. They were using their wealth strategically to create an entirely new global system with themselves at the center. In 1949, NATO was established, an American-led military alliance that replaced Britain's traditional role as the guarantor of Western security. American troops were stationed permanently in Europe. American nuclear weapons protected Allied nations. American military dominance was institutionalized. Domestically, America was absolutely thriving. The 1950s brought unprecedented economic expansion, mass production, consumer culture, and the rise of the American middle class. While Britain was still rationing food until 1954, Americans were buying automobiles, televisions, and suburban homes. By 1950, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's total gross domestic product. Half of everything produced globally. Britain was producing less than 7%. The transition was completely finished. But here's something that people often overlook. America didn't simply inherit Britain's former position through passive good fortune. They actively and deliberately took control. 1956, the Suez Crisis. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, which was crucial for British interests. Britain and France, secretly coordinating with Israel, invaded Egypt to retake control of the canal. This was an old-fashioned imperial power play of the type Britain had been using for centuries. America immediately shut down this operation. President Eisenhower was absolutely furious. He hadn't been consulted about the invasion. He viewed it as a reckless colonialism that could escalate into global conflict during the Cold War. America threatened severe economic sanctions and demanded that Britain withdraw immediately. Britain's currency came under intense pressure in international markets. They desperately needed American financial support to defend the pound. They didn't receive it. The pound sterling crashed. Britain was publicly humiliated on the world stage. Prime Minister Anthony Eden was forced to resign. Britain and France withdrew from Egypt in complete defeat. The global community learned a crucial lesson from the Suez Crisis. Britain could no longer act independently in international affairs. If America said no to British actions, the answer was definitively no. That crisis represented the final symbolic moment marking the end of British imperial power. From that point forward, there was absolutely no question about who led the Western world. So what actually changed when America replaced Britain as the global superpower? The fundamental structure of international dominance evolved dramatically. Britain's empire had been built on direct control, physical occupation of territory, and direct political rule over subject populations. America constructed something entirely different. America built military alliances instead of maintaining colonies. They pursued economic integration rather than resource extraction. They exercised cultural influence instead of direct governance. The American system wasn't about physically owning and controlling the world. It was about organizing and coordinating global systems. America didn't need a traditional empire in the historical sense. They established over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries worldwide. They controlled the world's reserve currency, which meant every nation needed American dollars to participate in international trade. They had Hollywood movies, Coca-Cola, and blue jeans, spreading American cultural influence without requiring military occupation. Most importantly, America had designed and dominated crucial international institutions. The United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and NATO were all structured according to American preferences and American leadership. This represented a completely new form of global power projection. What happened to Britain during this transition? Britain certainly didn't disappear from international significance. London remained an important global financial center. British culture, the English language, and British legal systems continued influencing countries worldwide. But Britain became a regional power and an important ally of America, rather than a rival or independent leader. Here's the uncomfortable historical truth that Britain was forced to learn. Empires don't end because they choose to end. They end because they run out of the resources necessary to maintain their position. Britain didn't lose World War I or World War II. They won both conflicts decisively. But winning those wars cost them everything they had accumulated over centuries. Every empire throughout history has believed it would last permanently. Rome thought it would endure forever. So did the Mongols, the Ottomans, and the Spanish. Britain genuinely believed the sun would never set on their empire. But the sun always sets eventually on every empire. Economic power forms the foundation of all other forms of power. Military strength, political influence, and cultural dominance all depend on underlying economic capabilities. When your economy weakens, everything else inevitably follows. Britain's fundamental mistake wasn't deciding to participate in 2 world wars. Their mistake was believing they could afford the cost of 2 total wars while simultaneously maintaining their global imperial position. The financial mathematics simply didn't work. America's crucial advantage wasn't merely geographical location or natural resource endowments. Their advantage was timing. They industrialized at exactly the right historical moment. They stayed out of major wars until participation became strategically advantageous. And when the old international order collapsed completely, they were prepared with comprehensive plans for a new system. But history never stops moving. America today faces its own significant challenges: rising national debt, intensifying economic competition, and a rapidly changing global order. There are other nations carefully watching America's situation, just as America once watched Britain's decline, waiting for their own moment of opportunity. The historical pattern repeats itself consistently. Empires rise when they successfully create and accumulate wealth. They fall when they begin consuming that wealth faster than they can generate new wealth. Britain consumed their accumulated wealth fighting 2 enormously expensive world wars. The question for America isn't whether their current position will eventually be challenged by rising powers. The question is whether American leaders will recognize the challenge early enough and whether they will make the same fundamental mistakes as their British predecessors or develop different strategies. The world never remains static. Power relationships never stay fixed permanently. The nation that leads the global system today is never guaranteed to be the nation that leads tomorrow. That's not pessimistic thinking. That's simply how history works. And history always continues moving forward. This is just one piece of the bigger picture. Subscribe if you want to understand the full context and how to better protect yourself in uncertain times. And the video on screen takes this story one step further.